In the northern fringes of the Capital Wasteland, on the outskirts of the Deathclaw-infested city of Olney, Maryland, a small rock ledge hides the entrance to a vault that served as the setting to one of the most dangerous experiments the Vault-Tec Corporation ever conceived. I'm the Resolute Cartographer, and this is the story of Vault 92. As the America of the Fallout universe stared down the likely nuclear apocalypse on the horizon, the government began to explore safeguards against the destruction of the population. One of these safeguards was the Vault-Tec Vault. While the cost of saving the entire population of the United States was prohibitive, a series of Vault-Tec vaults could preserve a small portion of the populace, allowing them to return to the surface and rebuild in the years after the bombs. While most of the vaults were general in their purpose, safeguarding hundreds of Americans from all occupations, there were a handful of specialty vaults, meant to protect something more specific. In the case of Vault 92, one of these specialty vaults, the reinforced lead-lined walls would protect the most talented musicians America had to offer. When the sirens began to scream on the morning of Saturday, October 23, 2077, the musicians filed into the narrow passage that granted them access to the vault. While others from Olney likely attempted entry, the vault's dedicated security team was ready to keep them out. When the bombs began to fall across the area, the heavy cog-shaped door spun closed. As radioactive fallout rained down across the countryside, a handful of survivors used the cave entrance of the vault as a temporary shelter before moving on. Life for those inside the vault began about as well as can be expected in the post-apocalypse. While most of the residents probably lived far better lives before the bombs, the Spartan accommodations of Vault 92 were far preferable to the wasteland that now lay outside. As the vault staff worked at maintaining the systems and the peace, the musicians picked up where they left off and began to practice and perform within the special soundproof studios provided by Vault-Tec. The pieces they played were then rebroadcast throughout the vault instead of the usual selections. In their time off, they recreated, playing pool, making use of the computers, and starting relationships with their colleagues. There were occasional issues with the vault systems. Vault 92 was 9 years old by the time the bombs came down, and a few problems with the lights were becoming apparent. Then there was the period in which the men's dormitory smelled like sewage because the waste line running past the AC line had corroded and leaked into the air. Despite these little problems, life fell into a basic routine of sleeping, eating, performing, and recreation. Unfortunately, this cycle would not go on forever. Engineering was beginning to deal with some real problems. There was an underground water source nearby that was beginning to force its way through the wall. Cracks were forming, and water was leaking in. Elsewhere, studio supervisor Parker Livingston noticed something was wrong with the playback equipment. There was a signal piggybacking on the recordings when he played them back for the musicians in the studio. He could not figure it out, so he contacted the vault's engineering team. With their efforts focused on the water leaking into the vault, it is unlikely that the engineers had the time to fix this apparently minor concern. Along with these equipment problems, some of the musicians were a little worse for the wear. Violinist Zoe Hammerstein was beginning to feel woozy after sessions. She went to Dr. Benison in the clinic, who told her to take it easy for a few days. Unfortunately, her condition only worsened until she could hardly think straight. Around this time, one of Zoe's similarly affected colleagues murdered 3 dwellers in a fit of rage, tearing them limb from limb and eviscerating them with his bare hands. It took 23 bullets fired by the security team to take him down, as he fought without fear or pain. While most of the populace looked at this event in fear, there were a handful of dwellers that viewed the murders with disappointment. These were the members of the science team. While the American populace knew about the existence of the specialty vaults, there was another classification for vaults known only to a select few within Vault-Tec. This classification was experimental or control. Control vaults were exactly what vaults had been advertised to be, a temporary safeguard for a small portion of the American people. Experimental vaults ran a wide range of societal experiments on their confined populations. Unfortunately for those within Vault 92, their vault was meant to perform as one of those experimental vaults. The experiment performed here was meant to determine how effective white noise could be as a medium to implant suggestion into a population. Until the murderous Rampage, the tests had been going well. Professor Malleus, the head of the science team, had added a white noise signal to the playback in the recording studio, resulting in those affected becoming more susceptible to suggestion. A full third of the musicians in the sessions would enter a trance-like state when affected and were open to implanted commands. These commands started off small, making the musicians scratch their ears or fix their hair, both of which worked perfectly. The sudden murders were completely unexpected. As the test subject that performed these horrifying acts had no history of violence, Professor Malleus surmised that somehow his suggestion was responsible. The professor sent Overseer Richard Rubin a message in which he expressed his determination to figure out the cause of this sudden insanity. Despite his best efforts, this triple murder was only the beginning. Over the coming weeks, another dozen musicians turned on their fellows and tore them apart. Everyone was on edge. Those that could got their hands on weapons, hoping to defend themselves should they come face to face with those they begin to call the Crazies. The Overseer ignored Professor Malleus's attempts to make contact. The security team was out in force, holding strong points throughout the vault, especially at the entrance to the Overseer's quarters. Despite the increased security, the situation only continued to deteriorate. When 30% of the population joined the Crazies, Professor Malleus expressed a need to evacuate the vault. It was clear that the situation was becoming unsalvageable, but despite this, the Overseer continued to avoid meeting with him or answering any of his messages. The mystery of why the test subjects were attacking everyone finally became clear to Professor Malleus through Regard's deathbed confession. Professor Malleus had only seen half of the experiment. He had been hiding his innocuous commands in the recording studio playback, watching the subtle changes in behavior take place in the musicians affected. Meanwhile, the Overseer had, with the aid of 3 of the professor's assistants, rerouted the white noise suggestion to the entire vault's loudspeaker system. He then hit the dwellers with this white noise suggestion day and night, going so far as to refuse to allow the distribution of personal headphones that might blunt his efforts. Worst of all, the white noise suggestion he broadcast was about combat. This had been Vault-Tech's plan all along. Watching the first subject take 23 bullets to go down was exhilarating for the Overseer. He imagined an army of soldiers that would, quote, never disobey a direct order from high command, and fight until it takes over 20 bullets to stop them, unquote. Beyond this, the Overseer even had a way to stop the Crazies, stating simply, quote, sanity is not statistical, unquote. The attackers would stop in their tracks. This was possible thanks to another command that slipped into the white noise that he shared only with the security team. With this knowledge in hand, Professor Malleus started to organize the remaining sane dwellers to take down the Overseer. Watching events unfold from his quarters, the Overseer knew the situation was bad. There was a rebellion forming within his vault. The reactor level was flooding, and the command that used to stop the Crazies was not working anymore. Rather than submit, he chose to order the killing of Professor Malleus. What happened next is not terribly clear. The little we do know is this: the vault was still filled almost entirely with the Crazies. The few remaining sane dwellers used a noise flush in the audio system to temporarily daze the Crazies. This was not enough to properly survive in the vault, and the door was open when the vault was encountered in 2277, so it seems that most of the population fled. The last sane message from the vault seems to be the words of John Adiglio, who locked himself in a storage closet. He wrote a message for his wife and children, letting them know he never succumbed to the madness. He then took his own life rather than be torn apart. Over the coming years, the vault became host to bloatflies and a family of mirelurks, who found a home in the flooded reactor area. The vault became a target for exploration by the lone wanderer of Vault 101 in 2277. He or she was led there by the words of the Wasteland radio violinist Agatha, whose long-lost relative was one of the original musicians in the vault. This distant relative, Hilda Egelbrecht, along with maintaining a steamy romance with studio supervisor Parker Livingston, was the owner of a Stradivarius violin. Following the clues given by Agatha, the lone wanderer can travel to Vault 92 and recover this violin, the Swa Stradivarius, and a book of sheet music from the men's bathroom, returning both to the aged widow. Alright, that's about all I found on the story of Vault 92, but I have some notes on the topic that I want to share. First, I want to start this section by saying that this experiment was one of the most dangerous undertaken within the vaults. I'm not saying that this experiment was more or less dangerous than the other experiments were to the inhabitants of the other vaults. I am saying that a successful outcome in Vault 92 would have yielded a massive problem for the general population. Every survivor of the war would be in danger of losing themselves to the whims of the users of this technology. While most vault experiments were potentially lethal to the vault inhabitants, the applications of this technology outside the vault could have far-reaching consequences. If the technology had proven to be effective, the signal could simply be broadcast on every radio in the wasteland and yield an army of slaves. As the experiment turned out, it's still dangerous technology, in that it could serve as a psychosis-inducing sonic weapon to anyone listening to an apparently innocuous radio broadcast. Second, the public concept for this vault does not make sense. If Vault 92 were meant to host the best musicians in the country, one would have to assume that those selected to fill it would have to relocate to be near the vault. While I'm sure that DC has great musicians, I doubt that all the best already lived in the city. Not only that, but given the strategic importance of Washington, D.C., and the likelihood that it would be struck rapidly and repeatedly in the event of a nuclear war, the musicians would have to live close to the vault, not just within the overall metropolitan area. While I'm sure Olney would love an influx of the most talented artists in the country, I must question how many of those artists would want to move to a small suburb 15 or so miles outside the capital. No offense intended to Olney, Maryland, but it would make far more sense for great musicians to have been given a spot in whatever vault is closest to them. It's not the case that the vault's experiment really required the best musicians as guinea pigs. While they needed the soundproof studio, could they not simply include it as a classroom, or even have it serve whatever musicians were among the population of any vault? As I was thinking about the issue with Vault 92, it made me think of Vault 76. No offense intended to Central West Virginia, but aside from natural beauty, what would the draw be for the best and brightest of America to be close enough to the vault to make it inside when the bombs came down? Third, there's an inaccessible area inside the vault. This area is a room in the sound testing section of the vault with a bookcase blocking the door. This room, with a few containers of loot in it, does have a second door leading to the Overseer's Tunnel in the Overseer's Quarters section of the vault, but that tunnel is inaccessible without using console commands to clip through the floor on PC. The tunnel was perhaps supposed to be openable from the Overseer's Terminal, but no option to open the stairs to the tunnel exists. Fourth, I have mentioned this before, but it needs to be said again. The world we get to explore in the Fallout games is a truncated version of the world of the Fallout universe. Vault 92, according to the Vault-Tec terminals scavenged by the Brotherhood of Steel, was built for 245 occupants. I counted a total of 31 beds. This is one of the simplest points to see the discrepancy between the stated and observed reality. But it is also visible in the terminal entry, Trouble Ticket 007 on the engineering terminal. This entry states, quote, "Billing my missed dinner with that sexy redhead violinist up in Women's Dorm 7 to Zach's work credit account," unquote. This means that there were at least 7 women's dorms. We only see 1 in the game. This point is not terribly important to the plot of the story here, but it's important to keep the scale of things in mind. Fifth, the floods suffered by the vault can likely be attributed to a seldom considered phenomena likely to occur following a mass depopulating event. For hundreds of years, people have been pumping groundwater out of the aquifers that underlie much of the country. Over the years, the wells into these aquifers must be drilled deeper and deeper to reach the receding waterline. This is because water is being pumped out faster than it can be replenished naturally by rainfall soaking into the ground. If an event like a nuclear war takes place, most of those wells will stop pumping. It is almost certainly going to be the case that the aquifers will begin to replenish almost immediately, and after a few years, or centuries depending on the region, the water table will likely rise to pre-human settlement levels. This is what I believed happened here in Vault 92. The groundwater returned to its original level and began to flood the reactor section of the vault. I must assume that some vaults drilled into the region around the Ogallala Aquifer would be at significant risk by the 2100s. Sixth, the noise flush used to temporarily disorient the Crazies can be used by the Lone Wanderer against the Mirelurk population. For whatever reason, this blast of white noise is lethal to the overgrown crustaceans. Lastly, there are a lot of Easter eggs, or at least potential Easter eggs, in this content. The term "sanity is not statistical" is a quote from George Orwell's 1984. The malleus in Professor Malleus is the name of a small bone in the middle ear that transfers sound vibrations from the eardrum. Overseer Richard Rubin might be a reference to music producer Rick Rubin. Violinist Zoe Hammerstein might be a reference to Oscar Hammerstein of the writing team Rodgers and Hammerstein. Supply manager Gordon Sumner might be a reference to the real name of the musician Sting. Violinist Hilda Egelbrecht might be a reference to Renate Egebrecht, a German violinist. Anyway, I think that'll do it for the story of Vault 92. If you want to receive notifications when I launch these lore videos, you can follow me on Twitter at Gaming with Maps. I've been streaming on YouTube lately. I'm currently streaming on Saturday afternoons when I have the time. So if you're interested, come by and check it out. If you appreciate what I do here and you want to support the channel financially, you can become a patron with Patreon. I want to thank my patrons Mesothelioma, 76 of Texas, Jill AWS, Dark Malcontent of Metaverse Studios, Brian, and Real76 for their support. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.